Daniel Morgan, a scarred combat medic from Fallujah, works quietly as a waiter, enduring stares and whispers. When teenagers, including Alex Wilson, mock his burns and snap photos, the diner hums with cruelty. But Carl Wilson, a retired sergeant, recognizes Daniel's Special Forces tattoo, sparking a revelation. Carl, whose son James was saved by Daniel's heroism, confronts Alex's thoughtless act. As Carl shares Daniel's story online, a wave of veteran support builds, hinting at a reckoning. Will the town see beyond Daniel's scars to honor the hero within? The truth is about to unfold, changing everything. If Daniel's story of courage and redemption moved you, join us at QH to uncover more hidden truths. Subscribe, share, and support our channel to honor unsung heroes. Type unfair in the comments if you believe no one should be judged by their scars. Let's keep their stories alive. On a bustling Saturday afternoon at the Riverside Diner, the hum of conversation mingled with the clink of cutlery. Amid the chatter, a sharp whisper cut through the noise. "Hey, Dad, check out the waiter's face. It's like totally messed up," muttered Alex Wilson, a lanky 16-year-old with a mischievous glint in his eye. His fingers danced across his phone, discreetly angling it to capture a photo of the waiter as he moved between tables. The group of teenagers at the nearby booth stifled their laughter, their eyes darting toward the waiter with a mix of curiosity and cruelty. The waiter, his head bowed, focused intently on wiping a coffee spill from a table, his movements deliberate, as if each swipe of the cloth was an act of defiance against the stares he knew were fixed on him. A low murmur came from one of Alex's friends, a wiry kid with a smirk. "Bet it was a gas explosion or something gnarly." The words hung in the air, sharp and careless, as the group snickered again. But at a booth nearby, Carl Wilson, Alex's father, felt his heart lurch. His weathered hands, calloused from years of gripping rifles and steering Humvees, froze mid-motion, his fork hovering above his plate of meatloaf. His eyes had caught something, a glimpse of ink peeking out from beneath the waiter's rolled-up sleeve. It was a faded tattoo, a medic's cross entwined with the unmistakable insignia of the Third Battalion, 5th Marines. Carl's breath caught in his throat. That symbol wasn't just a mark. It was a badge of honor, a silent testament to the hell of Fallujah, where he and his brothers in arms had faced death together. His gaze shifted to the waiter's face, tracing the deep scars that marred the left side, jagged lines that told a story of fire and sacrifice. In that moment, recognition flickered, then roared to life like a flare in the dark. This wasn't just any waiter. This was Daniel Morgan, a man Carl had last seen in the chaos of a battlefield, dragging a wounded Marine from a burning Humvee. Daniel Morgan, now 38, carried the weight of his past in every step. 5 years earlier, during a patrol in Fallujah, an IED had ripped through his unit's convoy. The Humvee ahead of him had erupted in flames, and without hesitation, Daniel, a combat medic, had sprinted into the inferno. His hands, steady even under fire, had pulled a fellow soldier to safety, but the explosion's wrath had caught him too. The blast seared half his face and neck, leaving a permanent map of pain etched into his skin. The scars were more than physical. They were a daily reminder of the life he'd left behind. After his medical discharge, Daniel had turned his back on the military world. The veteran meetups, the reunions, the well-meaning pats on the back, they all felt like salt in an open wound. He wanted no pity, no reminders of what he'd lost. So he'd settled in Riverside, a sleepy town where no one knew his name or his story. The job at the Riverside Diner was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to earn an honest living while keeping the world at arm's length. Each shift was a quiet battle. Daniel had perfected a routine to shield himself from the stares. He approached tables from his right side, where the scars were less pronounced, his voice low and clipped to keep interactions brief. He placed plates with precision, retreating before anyone could linger too long on his appearance. The diner's manager, Mike, had suggested kitchen work, a place where Daniel could stay out of sight. But Daniel had refused. Hiding felt like surrender, and he'd fought too hard to let shame win. Still, the whispers followed him. Parents tugged their children closer when he neared, their eyes flickering with discomfort or pity. Teenagers, like the ones snickering now, were the worst. Their laughter stung like shrapnel, cutting deeper than he'd ever admit. Today, as he balanced a tray of drinks, Daniel's ears caught the familiar sound of muffled giggles. His hearing, sharpened since the explosion as if to compensate for his scarred exterior, picked up every word. "Check this out," Alex whispered to his friends, his phone angled to capture Daniel's profile. "Dude looks like he walked out of a horror flick." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, igniting a familiar burn of humiliation that spread through his chest. His face remained a mask of neutrality, a skill honed over years of enduring worse. His grip on the tray tightened, the plastic creaking faintly under his fingers. But he kept moving, his steps measured, his eyes fixed on the next table. Inside, though, his heart churned with a mix of anger and exhaustion. He'd faced enemy fire, carried men through hell, yet here he was, reduced to a spectacle for bored kids. At the nearby booth, Carl Wilson was trying to focus on his son. He'd been explaining the maze of college applications, his voice steady but warm, hoping to instill some sense of direction in Alex, who seemed more interested in his phone than the future. But then he'd seen Daniel, and the world had tilted. The tattoo, the scars, the way the waiter moved with a quiet resilience. It all clicked into place. Carl's mind raced back to Fallujah, to the screams and the smoke, to the medic who'd risked everything. His chest tightened with a mix of awe and guilt. How had Daniel ended up here, serving coffee to people who mocked him? Carl's eyes flicked to Alex, who was still chuckling with his friends, oblivious to the weight of his actions. Another photo snapped, the flash barely concealed, and Carl's stomach twisted. The disrespect, the casual cruelty, it was too much. "Dad?" Alex's voice broke through, tinged with confusion. He'd noticed his father's sudden stillness, the way his jaw had tightened. "What's wrong?" Carl didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on Daniel, who was now delivering water to a nearby table, his movements precise despite the laughter trailing him. Carl's heart pounded with a mix of pride for the man he recognized and fury at his son's ignorance. Without a word, he reached across the table, his hand closing firmly around Alex's wrist. The phone clattered softly against the table as Carl forced it down, his grip unyielding. His eyes met Alex's, a silent command to stop, to see the man, not the scars, not the story they'd invented, but the hero standing before them. Carl's voice sliced through the diner's hum, low and edged with a gravity that made the air feel heavier. "Alex, that was the worst thing I've ever seen you do." His words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that pinned his teenage son to the booth. Alex's grin, so cocky moments before, wavered like a flickering light. His shoulders slumped and a flush crept up his neck as he tried to shrug it off. "Dad, chill, it's just a photo. We were messing around, that's all." But inside, Alex felt a prick of unease, a nagging sense that he'd crossed a line he didn't fully understand. His dad's eyes, usually warm, were now hard as steel, fixed not on him, but on the figure of a man weaving through the diner, balancing plates with quiet efficiency. That man, Daniel, wasn't what Alex or his friends thought. Not even close. Carl's mind churned with memories he'd buried deep, images of dust and blood and chaos. He wanted to grab his son by the shoulders, shake him, make him see. If you think a good man deserves to be remembered, stay here and learn what that means. But he held back, his jaw tight, knowing words alone wouldn't bridge the gap between Alex's carefree world and the one Carl had lived through. Carl Wilson had spent 18 years in the Marine Corps, retiring as a platoon sergeant with scars, some visible, most not. He'd led men through the hell of Fallujah, where the air tasted of smoke and fear. Daniel, the man now clearing tables in this small-town diner, had been there too, a combat medic in a different company. Carl hadn't known him personally, but the stories had spread like wildfire. They called him the Doc, the young medic who'd carried 4 Marines through a hail of enemy fire to safety. Despite burns that seared his skin when their transport was hit, Daniel had gone back into the flames, again and again to pull out the wounded. The last man he'd saved was Lieutenant James Wilson, Carl's eldest son. James had survived, though the limp he carried was a constant reminder of that day. Carl's chest tightened at the thought, gratitude and guilt warring within him. And now here was Daniel, his face marked by those same burns, enduring the snickers of kids who didn't know the cost of his courage. Alex shifted in his seat, his discomfort growing under his father's unrelenting gaze. He'd snapped the photo on a whim, egged on by his friend's laughter. The waiter's scars, jagged, red, impossible to ignore, had seemed like fair game for a quick joke. Now, with his dad's disapproval boring into him, Alex felt smaller, like he'd been caught stealing something precious. He didn't get why this mattered so much, but the shame pooling in his gut told him it did. "Alex, hand me your phone." Carl's tone was iron, leaving no room for debate. Alex's mouth opened, ready to protest. "What's the big deal? It's not like we hurt anyone." But the look in his dad's eyes stopped him cold. His heart thudded as he slid the phone across the table, his fingers lingering on it like he could take back the moment. Carl's calloused hands moved swiftly, deleting the photos with a few taps. Then he stood, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "Stay here," he said, his voice clipped but heavy with purpose. Alex nodded, his throat tight, watching his father stride toward the manager's station. Carl's heart pounded as he approached the balding man in his 50s, who was hunched over a stack of receipts. Mike, the manager, looked up, his face creasing with mild annoyance at the interruption. "Excuse me," Carl said, keeping his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "The waiter with the burn scars, I need to speak with him." "Privately." Mike's brow furrowed and he shifted uncomfortably. "Daniel's in the middle of his shift. Is there a problem with your service?" Carl shook his head, his eyes never leaving Mike's. "No problem. I owe him a thank you for something from a long time ago." The words felt inadequate, too small to carry the weight of what Daniel had done. Mike hesitated, then disappeared into the kitchen. Carl waited, his hands clenched at his sides. Memories of Fallujah flickering in his mind, explosions, screams, the acrid smell of burning metal. When Mike returned, his frown deepened. "Daniel doesn't want to talk to anyone. He's private about his past." Carl nodded, a pang of respect mixing with his disappointment. He understood. Men like Daniel, who'd seen the worst of war, often chose silence over spotlight. He pulled a napkin from the dispenser and scribbled his name and number, his hand shaking slightly. "Please, give him this. Tell him it's from Lieutenant Wilson's father. He'll know what it means." Mike took the napkin, his expression softening, and Carl turned away, hoping the message would reach the man who'd saved his son. That evening, Carl sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen casting shadows across his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and sorrow. He opened a private Facebook group for Iraq War veterans, a place where men like him shared stories too raw for the outside world. The blank comment box stared back at him, daring him to put his thoughts into words. Finally, he began to type, each keystroke deliberate. "Today, I watched a hero be mocked while wearing a waiter's apron. The medic who saved my son and 3 others during Operation Phantom Fury is serving burgers in my hometown, taking abuse for the scars he earned pulling Marines from a burning wreck. What kind of country have we become when we can't see the sacrifice standing right in front of us?" He hit post, his chest tight, unsure if his words would matter. By midnight, the post had spread like wildfire, shared 197 times across veteran networks. By morning, it had reached thousands. Veterans, active duty Marines, military families across 3 states. Carl refreshed the page, his eyes stinging as he read the comments pouring in. Stories of other forgotten heroes, promises to visit the diner, calls to honor Daniel's service. He felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by the bitter knowledge that Alex's friends had doubled down on their cruelty. Unbeknownst to Carl, Alex's buddies had posted their own photos of Daniel online, captioning them with cruel jabs about his scars. They'd laughed as they hit share, oblivious to the storm they were stirring. Within hours, their posts were swamped with furious comments from veterans and service members. "That's combat medic Daniel Morgan," one wrote, their words searing with righteous anger. "You're spitting on a man who saved more lives in a single day than you'll ever touch in your pathetic existence." The backlash grew, a tidal wave of outrage demanding the photos be deleted and apologies made. Meanwhile, Daniel worked his Sunday morning shift, his head down as always. The diner buzzed around him, clinking dishes, murmured conversations, the sizzle of the grill. He moved with quiet precision, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, his scars drawing the occasional stare he'd long learned to ignore. Inside, he carried a weight no one saw. Memories of fire and blood, of men he'd saved and those he couldn't. He didn't know about the photos, the posts, or the growing movement to honor him. All he knew was the rhythm of his work, the small dignity of doing his job well. As he wiped down a table, his thoughts drifted to Fallujah, to the faces of the Marines he'd pulled from the flames. He pushed the memories down, focusing on the present, unaware that the world was about to remind him of the hero he'd never stopped being. The air in Riverside Diner had shifted, subtle but undeniable. For weeks, Daniel Morgan, known to the staff only as the quiet, scarred man who scrubbed dishes with methodical precision, had felt the weight of customers' stares. Their eyes once held a mix of pity and unease, lingering on the jagged scars that crisscrossed his face and arms, remnants of a past he never spoke of. But now something was different. The glances carried a new warmth, a flicker of respect that unsettled him as much as it intrigued him. He caught whispers among the regulars, fragments of stories about a man called Doc, who'd done something extraordinary. Daniel pushed the thoughts aside, chalking it up to small-town gossip, but the knot in his chest tightened with every curious look. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, as the diner's lunch rush faded, a young server slipped an envelope onto the counter near Daniel's station. It was plain, unassuming, addressed simply to Doc Morgan, in careful, slanting handwriting. Daniel froze, his calloused fingers hovering over the paper. No one here knew that name. He'd buried it years ago, along with the memories of desert sand and gunfire. With a glance to ensure no one was watching, he opened the letter, his breath catching as he read the words scrawled inside. "You carried me 2 miles through enemy fire when both my legs were blown to hell. If you're washing dishes, I'll mop floors any day. Some debts can't ever be squared. Semper Fi, a grateful Marine." The words hit like a punch, dragging him back to a night of chaos, screams, smoke, the weight of a wounded man slung across his shoulders. His hands shook as he folded the note, tucking it into his pocket like a secret too heavy to hold. In the break room, Mike, the diner's manager, spotted the letter where Daniel had left it briefly on the table. Mike was a practical man, not prone to sentiment, but as he read the note, his view of the reserved dishwasher began to crack. He'd always seen Daniel as reliable but distant, someone whose scars made customers flinch, prompting Mike to quietly suggest Daniel stick to back-of-house duties. Now guilt gnawed at him. He replayed every curt instruction he'd given, every time he'd overlooked the man's quiet dignity. By the time he locked up that night, Mike's mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of who Daniel might be. Word spread, as it always does in a town like Riverside. By Monday morning, the diner was transformed. At 7 o'clock a.m., when the first servers were still brewing coffee, a dozen men and women in crisp military uniforms filed in. Marines in dress blues, Army soldiers in service greens, Navy personnel in starched whites. They took seats at scattered tables, their posture ramrod straight, their voices low but deliberate. Each placed a small, handwritten card beside their water glass. The words, "Thank you, Doc," inked in careful script. By 8 their numbers had swelled, the diner buzzing with a quiet intensity that made the air feel electric. Regulars gaped, sensing something profound unfolding, but unsure of its shape. Daniel arrived for his shift at 8:30, his worn boots scuffing the linoleum as he approached the entrance. He stopped dead, his heart lurching at the sight of the uniforms filling the room. The sea of military insignia was a ghost from his past, a world he'd fled. His first instinct was to turn back, to slip away before anyone noticed. The attention felt like a spotlight burning through the armor he had built over years of silence. But his feet stayed planted, rooted by something he couldn't name. Maybe duty, maybe curiosity, maybe the faint hope that he wasn't as alone as he'd believed. Mike approached, his face flushed with a mix of awe and nerves. "Daniel," he stammered, "these folks, they're here for you. I had no idea. I didn't know who you were." His voice broke, and Daniel saw the man's regret, raw and unguarded. Nodding stiffly, Daniel moved to the break room, tying his apron with hands that trembled despite his calm exterior. As he began his routine, filling water pitchers and clearing tables, his mind churned. Why now? Why here? He'd chosen this nowhere town to disappear, to be nobody. Yet here they were, these strangers who knew his name, his story. At the first table of Marines, a gunnery sergeant stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. He snapped a salute, sharp and precise, his voice booming in the hushed diner. "Doc Morgan, thank you for not leaving anyone behind that night." Daniel's grip on the pitcher tightened, his knuckles whitening. The room seemed to spin, the sergeant's words pulling him back to a blood-soaked street in Fallujah. He wanted to bolt, to hide, but the man's outstretched hand anchored him. After a beat, Daniel shook it, the contact grounding him, though his throat was too tight to speak. One by one they came. A grizzled Army vet clapped Daniel's shoulder, introducing himself as a medic from a unit that had fought alongside Daniel's. A young Marine, barely older than a kid, thanked him for saving a friend he'd never met. Each encounter chipped away at the wall Daniel had built, leaving him raw and exposed. A woman in navy dress blues approached, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She pressed a small velvet box into his hand, her voice soft but steady. "This was my father's Purple Heart. You saved him that night, though he passed last year from his wounds. He made me swear I'd find you." Said this medal belonged to the true hero of Fallujah. Daniel opened the box, the metal glinting under the diner's fluorescent lights. His chest ached with a grief he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He tried to return it, but she shook her head, her smile resolute. "It's yours, Doc." By mid-morning, the diner was a spectacle. Local news vans crowded the parking lot, cameras trained on the entrance. Mike, who just days ago had winced at Daniel's scars, now stood before the reporters, his voice thick with pride. "We're honored to have a hero like Daniel Morgan working here," he declared, the words feeling like atonement for his earlier missteps. Inside, the crowd parted as Carl Wilson, a local farmer, entered with his sons, Alex and Lieutenant James Wilson. James, his limp pronounced from an old injury, made a beeline for Daniel. "You probably don't remember me," he began, his voice tentative. Daniel's eyes met his, steady and sure. "Third vehicle in the convoy, fractured femur, shrapnel in your lower back. Kept trying to stand, even with your leg busted." The memory was vivid, James's stubborn courage etched in Daniel's mind. They embraced, a fierce, unspoken bond passing between them, two men who'd seen hell and survived because of each other. The diner hummed with stories, each veteran carrying a piece of Daniel's past. He moved through the crowd, his face a mask of composure, but inside he was unraveling. Gratitude warred with guilt, pride with shame. He'd never wanted to be a hero, just a man who did what needed doing. Yet here, in this small-town diner, his past had found him, and with it, a truth he couldn't outrun. The lives he'd touched, the debts he'd never claimed, were real. As the morning stretched on, Daniel felt something shift, a weight lifting, not gone but lighter. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. The diner buzzed with the usual hum of clinking plates and murmured conversations, but today the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Cameras had caught a fleeting moment earlier that morning, a moment that would ripple far beyond the Riverside Diner's worn linoleum floors. James Wilson, a grizzled veteran with a weathered face that carried the weight of too many memories, turned to his younger brother Alex, his eyes narrowing with a mix of expectation and quiet authority. "Go on, Alex," he said, his voice low but firm, nudging the teenager forward. "You've got something to say to Daniel." Alex, barely 16, stood frozen for a moment, his sneakers scuffing against the floor. His face burned a deep crimson, the kind of flush that comes from being caught in a truth you can't outrun. Just days ago, he'd snapped photos of Daniel Morgan, the diner's quiet server, his scarred face and prosthetic arm making him an easy target for cruel teenage mockery. Those photos, shared in a thoughtless moment of bravado, had spread like wildfire across social media. Each like and retweet a fresh stab at Daniel's dignity. Now, standing before the man he had wronged, Alex felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, a knot of shame twisting in his gut. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, cracking under the strain of his own regret. "I didn't know, I didn't think. It was stupid. I was cruel, and there's no excuse for it." His eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet Daniel's gaze, afraid of what he might see there, anger, judgment, or worse, pity. Daniel, his apron slightly askew from a long morning of serving coffee and clearing plates, studied the boy in front of him. His own face, marked by scars that told a story of sacrifice few could fully grasp, remained calm, his eyes steady but not unkind. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, not from the old wounds that had left his body broken, but from the memory of being seen as less than human, a spectacle rather than a man. Yet there was something in Alex's trembling sincerity that stirred a flicker of compassion. "I forgive you," Daniel said, his voice simple but resolute, carrying the quiet strength of someone who had faced far worse than a teenager's cruelty. He paused, letting the words settle, then added, "Just remember, no one chooses how they get wounded, but we all choose how we treat each other afterward." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, a reminder to Alex and to himself that every interaction was a chance to rebuild or destroy. By afternoon, the cruel photos that had once dominated social media feeds were gone, replaced by new images that told a different story. There was Daniel, surrounded by veterans who stood tall despite their own scars, their faces a mix of pride and camaraderie as they posed with him. Another showed Daniel shaking hands with James Wilson, the older man's grip firm, his eyes gleaming with respect. And then there was Daniel at work, moving through the diner with a quiet grace, serving tables despite the commotion that had erupted around him. Every step, every small gesture, radiated a dignity that no camera could fully capture, a strength born from years of carrying burdens most would never understand. During a rare lull in the lunch rush, Mike, the diner's manager, approached Daniel, his usual gruff demeanor softened by a rare vulnerability. His hands fidgeted with a dish towel, betraying the unease that had been gnawing at him all day. "Daniel," he began, his voice thick with the weight of his confession, "I owe you an apology." He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping briefly before meeting Daniel's. "When customers complained about your appearance, your scars, your arm, I should have stood up for you. I should have told them to get lost. Instead, I asked you to take less visible shifts, to stay in the back. I was wrong and I'm sorry." The admission hung between them, raw and unguarded. Mike felt the sting of his own cowardice, the realization that he'd let fear of losing business outweigh his loyalty to a man who deserved better. Daniel listened, his expression unreadable but not cold. He felt a familiar pang, not anger but disappointment, tempered by the understanding that people often falter under pressure. He nodded, a small gesture that carried more grace than Mike felt he deserved. "It's okay," Daniel said, his voice steady, though inside he wrestled with the memory of those quieter shifts, the sting of being hidden away like a blemish on the diner's reputation. But he let it go, as he had let go of so much else, choosing to focus on the work that grounded him. As the day drew to a close, Mike made a decision. Before locking up, he hung a new sign by the diner's entrance, the ink still fresh from the printer. It read, "Proud to have American heroes on our staff. Medal of Honor nominee Daniel Morgan serves here." The words were bold, unapologetic, a declaration of respect that Mike wished he'd made sooner. He glanced at Daniel, who was wiping down tables with the same methodical care he always did, and felt a quiet resolve to do better. As the last customers left, Carl Wilson, James's older brother and a retired Marine, lingered near the counter. He waited until the diner was nearly empty, the hum of the evening settling into a soft quiet. Approaching Daniel, he leaned against the booth, his weathered hands clasped loosely in front of him. "Why here?" he asked, his voice gentle but curious, the question carrying a weight that only another veteran could understand. "With your record, your service, your sacrifice, you could have your pick of jumps. Veteran advocacy, military liaison roles, something with prestige. Why a diner?" Daniel paused, a damp rag still in his hand, his eyes distant as he considered the question. He felt the familiar pull of memories, explosions, screams, the weight of lives he couldn't save, and the ones he did. The Medal of Honor nomination, a badge of valor that felt more like a chain some days, loomed in his mind. "Because here," he said finally, his voice soft but steady, "I'm just Daniel. Not a sob story, not a poster boy for the military, not a living reminder of the worst day of anyone's life." He paused, glancing around the diner, its worn booths and flickering neon sign a sanctuary of normalcy. Or at least I was. The words carried a quiet ache, a longing for the anonymity that had been stripped away by the viral photos in the sudden spotlight. Carl nodded, his own memories of war and its aftermath flickering in his eyes. He understood, perhaps better than most, the burden of being seen as a hero when all you wanted was to be human. The weight of heroism was a silent load, heavier than any metal, and civilians rarely grasped its toll. The next morning, Riverside Diner opened to an unexpected sight, a line of customers stretching around the block, a mix of veterans in faded caps, military families with proud but weary faces, and community members drawn by the story of a man who served in more ways than one. They waited patiently, some to shake Daniel's hand, others just to sit in his section, to be served by a man whose quiet strength had become a beacon. Among them were the teenagers who had once mocked him, now subdued, their heads bowed as they handed out flyers for a fundraiser supporting wounded warriors. Their faces were no longer smug but earnest, their actions a silent plea for redemption. Alex, in particular, moved with a quiet determination, his hands trembling slightly as he passed out each flyer, each one a step toward making amends. A month later, a letter arrived from the Pentagon, its official seal stark against the plain envelope. It invited Daniel to a ceremony honoring battlefield medics, with a mention that the Medal of Honor, recommended years ago but delayed by bureaucratic tangles, might finally be awarded. Daniel read the letter in the dim light of the diner's break room, his fingers tracing the words as a mix of pride and reluctance stirred within him. The recognition was an honor, yes, but it felt like a tether to a past he'd worked hard to leave behind. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his locker, the decision already forming in his mind. "You're not going?" Mike asked, his brow furrowing when Daniel mentioned declining the invitation. He leaned against the counter, concern etched into his face. He'd seen Daniel's scars, heard whispers of his heroism, but he couldn't fully grasp why someone would turn away from such an honor. "I'm fine right here," Daniel replied, his voice calm but firm, a quiet resolve underpinning his words. "I don't need medals or ceremonies. I just need normal days where people see me, Daniel, the guy who pours their coffee, not my scars or my past." Inside, he felt a flicker of longing for the simplicity he'd carved out, a life where he wasn't defined by what he'd lost or what he'd done. The diner had changed in subtle ways since that day. Customers who once avoided Daniel's section, uncomfortable with his visible wounds, now sought him out, their smiles warm, their requests specific. Veterans still came regularly, their presence a quiet solidarity, but they respected his unspoken wish for normalcy, treating him as Daniel the waiter, not Doc the war hero. The diner felt more like a community now, a place where stories were shared over coffee, where scars, seen and unseen, were acknowledged but not fetishized. One Tuesday morning, as Daniel took his usual break in the back room, he found a handwritten card resting on his chair. The words were simple, scrawled in a teenager's uneven hand. "Your scars are medals we cannot wear for you." No signature, but Daniel recognized Alex's handwriting immediately. He held the card, his throat tightening as he felt the weight of the boy's words, a quiet acknowledgement of the cost of his service. Looking through the break room window, he saw the diner bustling with life, customers laughing, plates clinking, the world moving forward. And for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to feel the warmth of being seen, not as a hero or a victim, but as a man who chose every day to keep showing up. As Daniel leaned over the service window, his eyes caught sight of Alex and a cluster of his high school classmates sprawled across the dining area of Mike's modest diner. The late afternoon sun filtered through the smudged glass, casting long shadows over the checkered floor. Daniel's heart stuttered, a familiar pang of dread tightening his chest. He braced himself for the usual sting of judgment, the phones that would inevitably rise, their cameras poised to capture the jagged scars that crisscrossed his face, a permanent reminder of the war he'd survived. But today the scene was different, and it stopped him cold. Instead of the cold glint of smartphone screens, he saw notebooks splayed open on the tables, pens scratching furiously as the teenagers leaned forward, their faces knit with concentration. At the front of the group stood an off-duty paramedic, her voice steady and clear as she guided them through the basics of first aid. Her hands moved with practiced precision, demonstrating how to wrap a bandage tightly enough to stem bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. Daniel's breath caught as he recognized the techniques. tourniquets, pressure bandages, the same skills he'd once wielded in the chaos of a battlefield. His hands slick with blood and his mind razor sharp despite the deafening roar of gunfire. Mike, the diner's owner, stood nearby, wiping down a counter with a rag, his broad shoulders relaxed but his eyes bright with quiet pride. He'd offered up the diner's space for these weekly first aid classes, a decision sparked by Daniel's own story, a story Daniel rarely spoke of, even to Mike, who'd become something of a friend over the months Daniel had worked here. It just felt right, Mike said later, his voice low as he shrugged, his weathered face breaking into a small, almost shy smile. After everything you have done, it's the least we could do. Mike didn't know the half of it, though. He didn't know how Daniel's hands, now steady as they cleared tables and scrubbed dishes, had once trembled with the weight of lives in his grasp. He didn't know how Daniel had knelt in the dirt, his own face torn open by shrapnel, applying tourniquets to his brothers in arms, willing their hearts to keep beating as bullets screamed overhead. Mike didn't know, but he'd sensed something in Daniel, something that deserved more than pity or whispers. And so, these classes had been born, a small act of tribute to a man who carried his wounds quietly, without complaint. For Daniel, watching the teenagers practice was like staring into a mirror of his past. Alex, with his earnest frown and clumsy fingers, fumbled with a tourniquet, his brow furrowed in determination. A girl with bright red hair tied back in a messy bun pressed a bandage against a mannequin's arm, her lips moving silently as she repeated the paramedic's instructions to herself. They were so young, their lives untouched by the kind of violence Daniel had known. Yet here they were, learning to save lives with the same fierce focus he had once had. The sight stirred something deep within him, a flicker of warmth in a heart he'd thought had gone cold long ago. He'd spent years hiding from the world, convinced his scars made him a spectacle, a walking tragedy to be gawked at or pitied. Every glance in a mirror reminded him of the cost of his survival, of the platoon he'd saved, of the friends he'd lost. But now, watching these kids who didn't know his story, but were learning the skills he'd used to preserve life, Daniel felt a shift. Maybe there was worth in being seen, scars and all. Maybe his presence, his quiet resilience could inspire something beyond whispers and stares. Honor, he realized, wasn't in the medals tucked away in a drawer back home, gathering dust. It wasn't in the uniform he could no longer bear to wear. It was in the way he carried his wounds, not as burdens, but as proof of a life spent fighting for others. It was in the way he moved through the diner, clearing tables with a quiet dignity, knowing he'd once held the power to save or lose an entire platoon. His hands, now wiping down sticky tabletops, had once stanched bleeding and steadied trembling soldiers. His heart, scarred as his face, still beat with the courage to keep going, to harbor no hatred despite the pain he'd endured. As the class wrapped up, the paramedic clapped her hands, and the teenagers began packing their notebooks, their chatter filling the diner with a lively hum. Alex glanced toward the service window, catching Daniel's eye. For a moment, their gazes held, no judgment, no pity, just a flicker of respect. Daniel nodded, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of his unspoken gratitude. Maybe, just maybe, being visible wasn't such a bad thing after all.